It started in a Chicago restaurant where mob bosses came for dinner and left with decisions that changed lives. Anthony Spilotro was a kid watching from the corner. By the time he was 25, he was a made man. By the time he was sent to Las Vegas, he was protecting millions in mob money. He tortured, he enforced, he survived indictment after indictment, until the outfit decided he had become a problem. On June 14th, 1986, Tony Spilotro walked into a meeting he believed was business. It was a death sentence. This is the true story of Anthony the Ant Spilotro. Anthony John Spilotro was born on May 19, 1938, in Chicago, Illinois, the fourth of 6 sons born to Pasquale Patsy Spilotro Sr. and Antoinette Spilotro. The Spilotros were Italian immigrants from Triggiano in the province of Bari. Patsy had arrived at Ellis Island in 1914, part of a generation that came to America with little more than a name and a trade. In Chicago, he built Patsy's Restaurant, a modest neighborhood eatery that became something more than a family business. By the 1940s and early 1950s, Patsy's Restaurant had become a quiet meeting place for members of the Chicago outfit. Men like Sam Giancana, Jackie the Lackey Cerrone, Gus Alex, and Frank the Enforcer. Nitty passed through its doors. Deals were discussed in low voices. Cars idled in the parking lot while made men stepped outside to talk privately. Young Anthony grew up watching these men. He saw how they carried themselves, how others deferred to them, how power moved without ever being announced. Spilotro attended Burbank Elementary School and later entered Steinmetz High School in 1953. By then, he was already developing a reputation in the neighborhood. He was small, 5'2" as an adult, but quick to fight. Shoplifting and purse snatching became routine. Police reports began to accumulate. By his late teens, he had already been arrested multiple times. The FBI would later estimate that by his 21st birthday, he had been arrested at least 13 times. In 1954, when Anthony was 16, his father died suddenly. The loss changed the structure of the family. Antoinette was left to raise 6 boys on her own. 4 of the Spilotro brothers, John, Vincent, Victor, and Michael, would eventually become involved in criminal activity. Only Patrick, who later became a dentist, chose a different path. Without his father's presence, Anthony drifted further toward the men who had once been customers in his family's restaurant. Street crime filled the space that school once occupied. He dropped out of Steinmetz High School as a sophomore. At 16, he earned his first arrest for attempting to steal a shirt. He was fined and placed on probation. The penalty had little effect. By the mid-1950s, Spilotro was no longer a kid watching mobsters from behind a restaurant counter. He was a young man looking for entry into their world. Chicago in those years offered a clear path for someone willing to enforce rules with violence. Anthony Spilotro understood that early. By the mid-1950s, Anthony Spilotro was no longer a teenager testing his limits. He was building a record. Arrests came steadily: shoplifting, larceny, street gambling, petty theft. By the time he reached his early 20s, he had been taken into custody more than a dozen times. Fines were paid, probation was handed down, jail time rarely followed. The system touched him but never held him. Chicago in those years was divided into neighborhoods, and each neighborhood answered to someone. Spilotro understood that if he wanted protection and opportunity, he needed sponsorship. He found it in Sam Mad Dog DeStefano. DeStefano was already known inside the Chicago outfit for his volatility. Even hardened mobsters considered him unstable. He had a reputation for cruelty that went beyond business. That reputation did not scare Spilotro. It attracted him. DeStefano saw something useful in the young man, someone small in stature, but willing to hurt people without hesitation. Around this time, Spilotro also developed relationships with other outfit figures. Vincent the Saint Incero moved in the same circles. Joseph Joey the Clown Lombardo was rising inside the organization. Joseph Joey Doves Ayupa, who would later become boss of the Chicago outfit, was already a powerful presence. These were not casual acquaintances. They were men who controlled gambling, loan sharking, and labor rackets across Chicago. For a brief period around 1962 or 1963, Spilotro worked for Irwin Weiner's bail bond company. It was a small detail in his career, but it placed him in constant contact with defendants, police, and courtrooms. He learned how charges were filed, how witnesses were pressured, how cases fell apart. It was education without a classroom. By 1962, Spilotro was firmly attached to DeStefano's crew. He was no longer operating as a street kid committing random thefts. He was part of an organized structure. The outfit valued loyalty and silence. Spilotro showed both. He also showed a willingness to do what others hesitated to do. Law enforcement had begun to recognize his name, but inside the Chicago underworld, his reputation was forming for a different reason. He was dependable when violence was required, and in that world, dependability carried weight. In 1962, Anthony Spilotro was given an assignment that would define his standing inside the Chicago outfit. Two small-time burglars, William McCarthy and James Miraglia, had crossed a line. The pair had killed thieves in Elmwood Park, a neighborhood where several outfit bosses lived. That area was considered off-limits. Violence there brought unwanted attention. Sam "Mad Dog" DeStefano's crew was tasked with sending a message. Spilotro played a central role. McCarthy was lured to a location under false pretenses. During the interrogation, Spilotro and the others tried to force him to reveal Miraglia's whereabouts. According to later court testimony and federal accounts, McCarthy's head was placed in a vice and tightened until one of his eyes protruded from its socket. His throat was eventually slashed. Miraglia was located soon after and killed as well. He was strangled. On May 14, 1962, the bodies of McCarthy and Miraglia were discovered in the trunk of a car on Chicago's South Side. The press would label it the M&M Murders. The brutality of the killings traveled quickly through Chicago's underworld. Within the outfit, it was viewed differently. The neighborhood had been defended, discipline had been enforced. Spilotro's role demonstrated loyalty and a willingness to carry out orders without hesitation. In 1963, he was formally inducted as a made member of the Chicago outfit. That status brought protection, authority, and responsibility. It also placed him permanently inside the organization's structure. That same year, he was implicated in another murder. Leo Foreman, a real estate broker and loan collector, had reportedly angered DeStefano after throwing him out of his office in May 1963. Foreman was later lured to a home under the pretense of playing cards. According to testimony presented in court, he was beaten with a hammer, stabbed repeatedly with an ice pick, and shot in the head before his body was left in the trunk of a car. Charles "Chucky" Grimaldi, a former member of DeStefano's crew who turned federal witness, testified against Spilotro and DeStefano in the case. Despite the graphic details, both men were acquitted. The jury did not convict. The pattern that would follow Spilotro for the next 2 decades was already visible. He was linked to extreme violence. He was tried, and he walked out of court free. By the end of 1963, Anthony Spilotro was no longer a young associate trying to prove himself. He was a made man with a reputation built on fear. After becoming a made member of the Chicago outfit in 1963, Anthony Spilotro was given responsibility over bookmaking territory on Chicago's northwest side. Gambling was steady money. It required organization, discipline, and the ability to intimidate debtors without drawing excessive attention. Spilotro handled all three. Throughout the mid and late 1960s, he operated gambling and loan sharking rackets while remaining closely aligned with the outfit's leadership. The murders that had earned him his reputation still followed him. Law enforcement suspected his involvement in a series of violent crimes during this period, but suspicions did not translate into convictions. Witnesses recanted, evidence fell apart, cases stalled. In 1967, Internal Revenue Service agents raided Spilotro's home as part of a crackdown on illegal gambling operations. Investigators determined he had been running a gambling business out of his residence. He was fined. He did not serve prison time. 2 years later, in 1969, Chicago police vice officers suspected Spilotro of operating a bookmaking racket from an abandoned basement. When officers moved in to raid the location, Spilotro and his associates attempted to destroy evidence by eating paper betting slips before police could seize them. Additional evidence was found in his office. Once again, he was arrested. Once again, he avoided incarceration. By the end of the decade, Spilotro had accumulated arrests, indictments, and fines, but no significant prison sentence. Federal investigators also believed he had participated in numerous homicides during the 1960s, though formal charges were either never filed or did not hold in court. Inside the outfit, this resilience carried weight. On the street, he had proven he could run profitable gambling operations. In the courtroom, he had proven he could survive prosecution. Both qualities made him valuable. By 1970, Anthony Spilotro had established himself as a dependable earner and an effective enforcer. Chicago had shaped him. The next move would take him far from it. By 1971, the Chicago outfit's interests had expanded far beyond Illinois. Las Vegas had become the pipeline. Money flowed through casinos in volumes that traditional rackets could not match, and much of it never appeared on official ledgers. The process was called the Skim. Cash was removed from counting rooms before it was recorded as taxable revenue, then quietly funneled back to Chicago. Joseph "Joey" Doves Ayupa, who had risen to boss of the Chicago outfit, needed someone in Las Vegas who could protect that pipeline. He chose Anthony Spilotro. Spilotro replaced Marshal Caifano as the outfit's on-the-ground representative in Nevada. His assignment was clear. 4 casinos on the Las Vegas Strip were under Chicago's influence: the Stardust, the Fremont, the Hacienda, and the Marina. These properties were officially managed by Frank Lefty Rosenthal, a skilled handicapper and casino operator. Rosenthal handled the public face of the operation. He worked the counting rooms, he oversaw the floors, he ensured profits stayed strong. Spilotro's role was different. He was there to protect the Skim. He was responsible for making sure the money moved safely and that no one interfered with Chicago's interests. If an employee skimmed from the Skim, he dealt with it. If an outsider threatened operations, he dealt with it. If someone inside the organization stepped out of line, he dealt with that too. Once in Las Vegas, Spilotro operated under the alias Tony Stewart at times and quickly inserted himself into the city's underworld. Officially, he had no casino license. Unofficially, he carried authority backed by Chicago. The early 1970s were a profitable period for the outfit. Millions were siphoned from casino revenues and routed back through couriers to Midwest bosses. The arrangement depended on discretion. Mob figures were expected to keep low profiles and avoid unnecessary publicity. Spilotro struggled with that balance. Las Vegas was not Chicago. It was open, visible, expanding. Law enforcement in Nevada was alert to outside influence. Federal agencies were watching the casinos closely. Spilotro's reputation followed him west, and so did the attention. Still, in 1971, he arrived in Las Vegas as the Chicago outfit's enforcer, entrusted with protecting one of the most lucrative rackets in organized crime. For the moment, he had both authority and backing. The city would test both. By 1972, Anthony Spilotro had been in Las Vegas for barely a year when Chicago's past came knocking. That year, he was indicted in connection with the 1963 murder of Leo Foreman, the real estate broker who had been beaten, stabbed, and shot after crossing Sam "Mad Dog" DeStefano. The case forced Spilotro to shuttle between Las Vegas and Chicago for court appearances. The prosecution leaned heavily on testimony from Charles "Chucky" Grimaldi, the former crew member who had turned government witness. In 1973, Spilotro was acquitted. The jury did not convict him. It was another courtroom survival. That same year, on April 14, 1973, Sam DeStefano was murdered. He was shot to death in Chicago. Federal authorities later suspected that Spilotro may have been involved in the killing, though no charges were filed against him. The suspicion was part of a broader pattern. When violence occurred within outfit circles, his name circulated quietly in investigative reports. Las Vegas was changing during this period. In 1974, the Los Angeles Times reported that the city experienced more gangland-style killings than it had in the previous 25 years combined. Spilotro's arrival in 1971 coincided with a noticeable rise in organized crime activity. Law enforcement in Nevada began to view him as a central figure behind the escalation. That same year, he was indicted for theft involving the Teamsters Union's Central States Pension Fund, a major financial engine that had helped bankroll casino developments. The charge carried serious weight. The outfit's access to union pension money was one of its most powerful financial tools. Yet, once again, Spilotro avoided conviction. The principal witness in the case died by shotgun blast before the matter could be resolved, and the prosecution collapsed. On June 19, 1975, former Chicago outfit boss Sam Giancana was shot and killed in his home. Federal investigators again suspected Spilotro's involvement, though no formal charges were brought. By this point, the FBI believed he was connected to a long list of homicides stretching back more than a decade. Estimates range from involvement in 22 to 25 murders. The evidence, however, never matured into convictions. Inside the outfit, Spilotro was still performing his primary duty in Las Vegas, protecting the Skim from the Stardust, Fremont, Hacienda, and Marina. Outside of it, he was drawing attention. Each indictment, each acquittal, and each suspected killing added to a growing federal file. By 1975, Anthony Spilotro had become more than an enforcer overseeing casino cash. He was a high-profile figure in a city that required subtlety. Law enforcement scrutiny intensified. And in organized crime, attention has consequences. By 1976, Anthony Spilotro had settled into Las Vegas. But overseeing the Skim was not enough. The casino sent money back to Chicago, and that money belonged to the outfit. Spilotro wanted income that he controlled more directly. That year, he opened a jewelry and electronics store called the Gold Rush. The shop was located one block off the Las Vegas Strip. His partners included his younger brother Michael Spilotro and Chicago bookmaker Herbert Fat Herbie Blitzstein. On paper, it was a legitimate retail business. In practice, it functioned as a fence for stolen property. The Gold Rush became a hub. Stolen jewelry, furs, electronics, and other valuables passed through its counters. Spilotro was careful about one detail. He avoided selling items that had been stolen locally in Las Vegas, reducing the risk that victims might recognize their property. He also suspected that the FBI had bugged the store, so conversations were measured and guarded. Around this storefront, he built a burglary crew that would become known as the Hole in the Wall Gang. The name came from their method. When doors and alarms were obstacles, they drilled through exterior walls and ceilings to enter high-end homes, hotel rooms, and commercial properties. The technique left a calling card. Key members included Frank Carlotta, a longtime associate from Chicago, who moved to Las Vegas in early 1979, along with Leo Guardino, Ernest Davino, Joe Blasco, Lawrence Neumann, Wayne Matecki, and others. At one point, even Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Officer Joe Blasco was associated with the group. The crew stole aggressively and frequently. The Gold Rush gave them a reliable outlet for their take. The burglary ring expanded Spilotro's influence in the city's street crime. It also increased his visibility. Homicides and high-end burglaries drew headlines. Federal and local investigators began connecting the pattern to him. In 1978, the Nevada Gaming Commission placed Spilotro in the state's Black Book, officially barring him from entering any casino in Nevada. The restrictions struck at the core of his assignment. He had been sent to protect Chicago's interests inside casinos he was now legally forbidden to enter. The ban did not stop him from operating. It did signal that Las Vegas authorities viewed him as a threat to the industry itself. By the end of the 1970s, Anthony Spilotro was running a burglary crew, fencing stolen goods, overseeing the Skim from a distance, and drawing more attention than the outfit preferred. The city was watching. So was Chicago. By 1979, the pressure around Anthony Spilotro was building from every direction. Law enforcement scrutiny had intensified. His name was circulating in federal investigations. Inside his own crew, cracks were beginning to show. That year, one of his associates, Sherwin Geri Lisner, was arrested for larceny. Lisner was not a peripheral figure. He had been connected to Spilotro's operations in Las Vegas and understood how the burglary ring functioned. After his arrest, word spread that Lisner intended to cooperate with federal authorities and testify before a grand jury. In the outfits world, cooperation carried one consequence. According to later court testimony, Spilotro discussed eliminating Lisner. Frank Carlotta, his longtime friend from Chicago and a central member of the Hole-in-the-Wall gang, was brought into the plan. Carlotta later testified that he believed the decision had been cleared by leadership in Chicago. In that structure, a murder, especially one involving a potential informant, required authorization from above. Carlotta carried out the killing. The problem was not the act itself. It was whether it had been sanctioned. Evidence presented in later proceedings suggested that Chicago leadership had not formally approved Lisner's murder. If that was the case, Spilotro had acted independently on a matter that affected the outfit as a whole. Unauthorized violence created instability. It invited retaliation. It drew attention. Around this same period, Carlotta would later testify that he became concerned for his own life. In 1982, while imprisoned, he was approached by the FBI with a wiretap recording of Spilotro speaking about having to clean our dirty laundry. Carlotta interpreted the statement as a contract on him. That fear would eventually push him toward cooperation. By the end of 1979, the Lisner murder had added another layer of tension between Spilotro and his superiors. He was already operating in Las Vegas with a high public profile, running a burglary crew, and maintaining a volatile personal life. Now there were questions about whether he was making decisions without clearance. In organized crime, authority flows downward. When someone begins acting upward or sideways, leadership notices. Chicago was watching closely. By the summer of 1981, the Hole-in-the-Wall gang was operating with confidence. The burglaries had grown bolder, the take had grown larger, and the scrutiny had grown heavier. On the night of July 4th, 1981, members of the crew targeted Bertha's gifts and home furnishings on East Sahara Avenue in Las Vegas. The job was expected to bring in substantial profits, reportedly close to $1 million in merchandise. The plan followed their familiar method. They would penetrate the building through the roof and remove high-value goods under cover of darkness. What they did not know was that police were already waiting. Authorities surrounded the store while the crew was inside. Frank Carlotta, Joe Blasco, Leo Guardino, Ernest Davino, Lawrence Neumann, and Wayne Matecki were arrested at the scene. Each was charged with burglary, conspiracy to commit burglary, attempted grand larceny, and possession of burglary tools. Anthony Spilotro was not present inside the building that night, but 2 weeks later, he was tracked down and arrested in connection with the operation. The failed robbery marked a turning point. The arrest of so many core members fractured the crew. One of the group's participants, Sal Romano, had already begun cooperating with authorities after being arrested on unrelated charges. The planned burglary had been compromised from within. In 1982, while facing his own legal jeopardy, Frank Carlotta made a decision that would permanently alter the landscape. After being shown wiretap recordings and fearing for his life, Carlotta agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors. He finalized an agreement in July 1982. For the first time, someone from inside Spilotro's inner circle was prepared to testify in detail about murders, burglaries, and the internal workings of the Las Vegas operation. Carlotta admitted involvement in more than 300 crimes, including 4 murders, robberies, perjury, and numerous burglaries. He named Spilotro as his superior and described orders he had carried out on his behalf, including the telephone call used to lure William McCarthy before the 1962 M&M Murders. In September 1983, Spilotro was indicted for conspiracy and obstruction of justice in connection with the 1979 murder of Sherwin Geri Lisner. That same year, he was retried for the 1962 torture killings of McCarthy and Miraglia. The prosecution relied heavily on Carlotta's testimony. Spilotro's defense attorney was Oscar Goodman, a Las Vegas lawyer who would later become mayor of the city. Goodman attacked the credibility of the government's witnesses, emphasizing Carlotta's admitted history as a hitman and career criminal. In October 1983, despite the detailed testimony presented against him, Spilotro was acquitted once again. The hole-in-the-wall gang had effectively collapsed. Its members were arrested, cooperating, or awaiting trial. The burglary ring that had fueled Spilotro's independent income was dismantled. What remained was a man still standing in court, still avoiding conviction, but now surrounded by informants and increasing federal pressure. Inside the Chicago outfit, patience was thinning. By the early 1980s, Anthony Spilotro's problems were no longer limited to indictments and informants. They had become personal, and in the outfit, personal problems often carried professional consequences. Frank "Lefty" Rosenthal had been the public face of the Chicago outfit's casino operations in Las Vegas. He managed the Stardust and other properties tied to the Skim. He was not a made man, but he was trusted with millions of dollars in diverted casino profits. Spilotro had been assigned to protect him and the operation. Somewhere along the way, that relationship fractured. Rosenthal was married to Geri McGee, a former Tropicana showgirl known around Las Vegas for her lifestyle and appetite for risk. By the early 1980s, Spilotro and McGee began an affair. It was not subtle. In mob culture, relationships with another man's wife, especially a key associate's wife, were considered a serious breach of conduct. In this case, it involved two men tied directly to the outfit's most lucrative racket. The tension became public knowledge inside organized crime circles. Word reached Chicago. In 1982, Rosenthal survived a car bombing outside a Las Vegas restaurant. The explosion destroyed his Cadillac but failed to kill him. No one was ever charged in connection with the bombing. Spilotro was suspected by some investigators, though there was no formal indictment tying him to the attack. Federal authorities listed him among those of interest, but evidence sufficient for prosecution did not materialize. That same year, Geri McGee was found dead in Los Angeles from an apparent drug overdose. The circumstances added another layer of chaos to an already unstable situation. Meanwhile, Spilotro's legal exposure was intensifying. He had been blacklisted from Nevada casinos. His burglary crew had collapsed. Frank Carlotta was cooperating with federal prosecutors. The Bertha's gifts case had drawn national attention. The Lisner murder indictment added to the pressure. His name appeared regularly in newspaper headlines. Law enforcement officials in both Nevada and Illinois were building cases against the Chicago outfit's leadership. Joseph Ayupa and John Cerrone were eventually imprisoned for skimming casino profits. Federal investigations were expanding. The spotlight on Las Vegas operations was brighter than ever. From Chicago's perspective, Spilotro had become a liability. He was visible. He was controversial. He was associated with internal disputes and unsanctioned violence. In a structure built on quiet profit and disciplined hierarchy, those traits carried risk. By the mid-1980s, Anthony Spilotro was still technically in charge of protecting the outfit's interests in Las Vegas. In practice, he was losing support. And in organized crime, support can disappear long before the final decision is made. In January 1986, senior members of the outfit gathered at the Czech Lodge in North Riverside, Illinois. It was a meeting of the upper echelon, men who had spent decades inside the structure. Tony Joe Batters Accardo, the longtime power behind the organization, remained influential. At the meeting, Accardo appointed Samuel Carlisi as street boss to replace Ayupa. Carlisi would oversee day-to-day operations. Accardo would remain as consigliere, retaining final authority. Gus Alex would continue managing connections and political relationships. With leadership realigned, attention turned to unresolved problems. Anthony Spilotro was at the top of the list. Since his arrival in Las Vegas in 1971, he had drawn consistent law enforcement attention. His burglary crew had generated publicity. Informants had testified in federal court. The Lisner murder raised questions about unauthorized action. His affair with Geri McGee had created internal resentment. Federal scrutiny of the casino Skim had intensified. From Chicago's perspective, Las Vegas was no longer producing quiet profits. It was producing headlines. During the meeting, according to later testimony, mob enforcer Rocco Infelice addressed the issue directly. He recommended that Spilotro be killed. The proposal was not met with resistance. Those present agreed. The decision was unanimous. In the outfit structure, once such a decision is reached, it moves from discussion to planning. The order did not require paperwork. It required coordination and silence. By January 1986, Anthony Spilotro was still alive, still technically representing Chicago in Las Vegas. He did not know that the organization he had served for more than 2 decades had already sealed his fate. On June 14, 1986, Anthony Spilotro and his younger brother Michael left Michael's home in Oak Park, Illinois. They told family members they were going to a meeting. According to later testimony, Michael had been led to believe he was about to be inducted into the Chicago outfit as a made member. That was the pretense used to bring both brothers back to the Midwest. They never returned. On June 16th, Michael's wife, Anne, reported both men missing. Days later, Michael's 1986 Lincoln was recovered in a motel parking lot near O'Hare International Airport. The disappearance quickly drew national attention. Anthony Spilotro had spent years under federal investigation. His sudden silence was noticed. On June 22, 1986, a farmer spreading herbicide in a remote cornfield near Enos, Indiana, close to Willow Slough Preserve, noticed an area of freshly turned earth where no crops were growing. The site was near Morocco, Indiana, roughly 60 miles southeast of Chicago and not far from land once owned by Joseph Ayupa. Authorities were notified. When the ground was opened, the bodies of Anthony and Michael Spilotro were found buried in a single grave, one on top of the other, stripped to their undershorts. An autopsy completed on June 24th determined that both men had died from blunt force trauma. Medical examiners concluded they had been dead since June 14th. They were identified through dental records provided by their brother Patrick, the family dentist. On June 27th, 1986, the Spilotro brothers were buried in a family plot at Queen of Heaven Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois. Early reports suggested the brothers had been beaten and buried in the Indiana cornfield. That version stood for years. Then, in 2007, during the federal Operation Family Secrets investigation, new testimony changed the understanding of what happened. Nicholas Calabrese, a longtime outfit member who agreed to cooperate with federal authorities, testified that the brothers were killed in a basement in Bensenville, Illinois. According to Calabrese, the Spilotros were lured there under the belief that Michael was to be formally inducted. Instead, they were attacked by a group of outfit members. Calabrese stated that Anthony realized what was happening and asked, "Can I say a prayer?" before the beating began. After the killings, the bodies were transported to Indiana and buried in the cornfield. For nearly 2 decades, no one was arrested in connection with the murders. On April 25, 2005, federal prosecutors indicted 14 members of the Chicago outfit for 18 murders, including the killings of Anthony and Michael Spilotro. Among those charged was reputed outfit boss James Marcello. The sweeping case became known as the Family Secrets Trial. On May 18, 2007, Nicholas Calabrese pleaded guilty to participating in a conspiracy that included 18 murders. He admitted involvement in planning or carrying out 14 of them, including the Spilotro killings. His cooperation was secured after the FBI presented DNA evidence linking him to the murder of fellow hitman John Feccarotta, who had also been connected to the Spilotro case. Calabrese agreed to testify against his brother Frank Calabrese Sr. and other high-ranking outfit members. In September 2007, Frank Calabrese Sr., James Marcello, Joseph Lombardo, Paul the Indian Shiro, and former Chicago police officer Anthony Twan Doyle were convicted of mob-related crimes. On September 27, 2007, a federal jury found James Marcello guilty of ordering the murders of both Spilotro brothers. On February 5, 2009, United States District Judge James Zagel sentenced Marcello to life imprisonment for the murders. On March 26, 2009, Nicholas Calabrese was sentenced to 12 years and 4 months in prison in exchange for his cooperation. Anthony Spilotro had survived indictments, mistrials, informants, and decades of suspicion. In the end, the organization that elevated him delivered the final verdict. The cornfield in Indiana closed the story that began in a Chicago restaurant nearly half a century earlier.